In this session, we will be exploring people and leadership, specifically building a modern-day team of rivals. The book Team of Rivals by Doris Goodwin tells the story of how Abraham Lincoln, upon assuming the presidency of the United States, constructed a cabinet of his chief rivals to the Republican nomination for the presidency, a team of rivals. It's a book that's inspired world leaders all over the world, and its popularity became rejuvenated when President Obama cited it as his inspiration for how he set up his administration in 2008. A team of rivals can bring us a more diverse collective brain, and in a world where complexity is the new norm, leveraging on the power of diverse teams is no longer optional, it's essential. So, without further ado, let's invite our three panelists for this final course session on people and leadership. Dr. Anya Schiffrin, Director, Technology, Media and Communications, Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. Dr. Johari Jalil, Group Managing Director, Senvairo Sendirian Berhad. And our keynote speaker from yesterday, Professor Michael Muthukrishna, Associate Professor of Economic Psychology, London School of Economics. To moderate this session, we call upon our own Effizal Faiz Zulkifly, Head, Energy Transition, Khazanah Nasional Berhad. The stage is yours, Effie.
Assalamualaikum and good afternoon, everyone. I'm sure everyone has been waiting for this session. They did put this session as the last one just before my boss's session. So I have with me today three distinguished speakers, as mentioned. First, Professor Michael Muthukrishna. Michael is the Professor of Economic Psychology and founder of Culturality at LSE. His work won several awards in areas surrounding culture, affecting innovation, corruption, decision-making, and how we can best navigate diversity and cultural differences. Secondly, we have Dr. Johari Jalil, the Group Managing Director of Senvairo, which is the largest integrated waste management solutions provider in Malaysia. He has over 20 years' experience in the oil and gas industry, with Shell and ExxonMobil, holding various functional and global roles. Finally, we have Dr. Anya. She is the Director of Technology and Media Specialization at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. Her work covers the areas like government policies in support of global journalism, platform remuneration and regulatory policies, and also generative AI. Please join me in welcoming the established speakers today. Okay, let me do a bit of a preamble, and I'll stand for this. So this session, as I mentioned, arguably is the most important session in the last 2 days. Why do I say that? Because it revolves around people and leadership. In the past 2 days, we've been discussing about growth, innovation, markets. I see that more of a discussion about what sort of potato we are looking for, what do we add on to the potatoes. But then, let me share with you this to help all of us internalize this thing. Yeah? So it seems like when China introduced the potatoes, it actually took 2 centuries for it to normalize, for the people to accept. So pause for a moment and consider throughout those 2 centuries, how many stakeholders needed to be managed? How many conflicts needed to be resolved? How many incumbents had to be displaced? How many pick and shovels were used to dig up holes? How many opium farms had to close? Opium farming in China started 600, you see. So, think about doing. The past 2 days was about thinking, new ideas, but spare a moment, this is about doing. And when we talk about doing, it's about people and leadership. This is why I feel this is the most important session in these 2 days. So we are discussing building the team of rivals. Here's one fact. The modern world today is highly interconnected and complex. Increased vulnerabilities. The problems are complex. What we hear day in, day out are paradoxes. We want profit and impact. We want telescopic and microscopic. We have the paradox of plenty. Yes, everyone gets rich, increased consumption, but at the same time, inequality gaps widen. So, I'm a bit like Batman. At evenings like this, I run panels. My day job is energy transition. What better way for me to say this? Energy transition is a bloody complex problem. Because we have that energy trilemma problem. This is what I do day in, day out. Number one, it's about balancing energy security. No one wants a blackout. It's about managing energy sustainability. We want low CO2. And this is the most important part. Managing energy affordability. No one wants to pay more. So, in a world where there's so many wants, so limited resources, there are bound to be diverse views. And this is where we get to the question, how do we build rival teams? Or, let me take a step back. Do we believe we need rival teams? And on that note, I'd like to come to first Professor Michael. Michael, you wrote The Theory of Everyone. Do you believe that the complex problems today requires team of rivals? And your work highlights the collective brain, new theories. So can you share with us your views on this? And examples that you've seen across countries?
Yeah, so... the last time I was on stage, I was mic'd up, so I was used to doing that. Yeah, so there's lots of evidence that we, as society becomes more complex, we increasingly specialize. And what that means is that we use our limited-sized brain to know a lot more about a lot less. So we know a lot more about a very small sliver of the world, and we're kind of stupid about everything else. If I had to suddenly, become an accountant or an investor overnight, I would probably be quite poor at it, right? But I'm good at my day job. So what that means is that often the new innovations are the intersections of these fields. The solutions to your problems are in other people's heads. I'll give you an example, one that's become more topical recently in the recent discoveries around AI. So in the 20th century, Marvin Minsky was a god at MIT in AI, and he had this model of human intelligence as logic plus evidence, right? Logic plus data. And what is better at logic plus data than a computer? So in 1970, he said, in the next 10 years, we're going to have computers that can think at the level of a human being. And he was wrong, of course. Now, he used to make fun of these other group of people that would call the connectionists. So people like Geoffrey Hinton, who was not a computer scientist actually, but trained as an experimental psychologist and a neuroscientist. And what Hinton wanted to do was to create a brain in silicon. So again, this is one discipline, trying to apply to another, and they thought, this wasn't going to work, and in fact, it didn't for a long time. It was only in the early 2000s when we had sufficient compute and we had sufficient data that suddenly computers could see things in an image, and then later could generate things, as we've seen with recent advances. So a lot of these pieces had to come together. A lot of different disciplines had to talk to one another in order for this new discovery to be made. And we see this over and over again, where finding potatoes is often really taking some solution from one place and applying it to another. It's a process that I call intellectual arbitrage, because there are these wonderful arbitrage opportunities across disciplines.
Okay. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Michael. So now, I'd like to move on to Dr. Johari. Okay, the waste management industry is something that I'm very fond of. it has gone through a bit of a change. This is an industry where it used to be managed by the likes of Tony Soprano and the Gambini family. But you know what? Overnight, ESG came into fruition. Everyone was talking about circular economy. Everyone was talking about green. And now, the professionals are into this space. The GLCs are in this space. So I guess the question is, and I would also like to add, Dr. Joe spent 20 years in Shell and ExxonMobil, which are MNCs. So I guess, Dr. Joe, my question for you is, given your perspectives, being in the waste management industry, going through that change, and also the fact that you spent quite a bit of time in GLC and an MNC, maybe to share your views, how you view this.
All right, thank you, Effie. And it is a privilege, right, sitting among the two esteemed scholars here. But I guess what value that I can bring into discussion is more about, from a practitioner point of view, just to balance up the equation of it. So I feel compelled a bit to add to the content of Senviro, since you have associated me with Sopranos. So again, Senviro is Malaysia's largest integrated waste management company, right? Not sexy, but very essential to the environment, right? And very critical to the nation. Yeah, our waste to energy plant in Sendayan, the entire integrated facility, is actually gazetted as National Critical Asset Level 1. Yeah? That essentially means it is as important as the ports and the airports of Malaysia, right? So the thesis on Senviro is about a company undergoing change, right, due to the market dynamics. It is not easy, right? And the reason for it is because there is an absence of burning platform. And everyone knows that burning platform is a key, yeah, to get people moving and all that. But change we must, to make sure that Senviro have a long runway, right, to preserve our existence in the market. Now, back to the context of MNC versus GLC. I think that's the one that you asked just now. So, from my humble perspective, working with Exxon and Shell, I think it's difficult to argue that the multinationals obviously are a bit mature in terms of having a good ecosystem, right, to allow diversity, teams of rivals thrive, if you like, right? Because you cannot get away, you cannot pretend to be able to raise diversity, collections of brain, like what Michael say, if the ecosystem, the leadership and all that are not prepared for it. Right, so I have seen the both end of the spectrum. When diversity really helps, it adds value, it's critical, especially to the multinationals who operates largely in a non-homogeneous manner. So essentially, they don't want to be blindsided with some nuances which they are not aware of. Therefore, the drive or the pursuit to get as many thoughts from their employees to make sure that their decision is sound, right? So one of the good examples that I can relate here is about our market entry strategies into a new market, right? So I was responsible for market entry in Shell Indonesia, and I cannot emphasize enough how important diversity in terms of making sure that we are really grounded, yeah, because at times, this multinational, they overthink a bit about their brand strength and all that, but in reality, right, brand preference does not necessarily mean with purchasing behavior, right? So because of that, a lot of thinking process, a lot of soliciting for ideas and all that, and it can be protracted. Yeah, in the sense that decision can take long, and people can get lethargic. And to be fair, we didn't even beat the next competitor in the market because of the time spent to get feedback, to get sound bites from the team. But the result of it, and I'm a witness to it, is that we came in, even though a bit later, but with a full, robust plan, right? Full of thought process from a spectrum of, marketing strategy, price positioning. You talk a bit about interpretation of brand preference survey, product life cycle. I mean, you cover the entire thing with a very strong thought process that enable us to prevail in Shell Indonesia. Yes, from a cold start, we call it. Shell Indonesia right now, as we speak, is the second largest market in the world, right? From lubricants point of view. So that essentially tells you a bit about the importance of diversity and MNC. But on the other hand, I also witness how diversity can be divisive, right? It can create frictions. It promote doing business among yourself, right? Because the time and energy spent to solicit ideas and to listen to them and all that. So diversity is a double-edged sword, if you like, right? Now, if you bring it to the context of the local, the GLCs, I mean, to be fair, I only work for one GLC, which is Enviro, which I'm very proud of. Diversity, teams of rival, in my humble opinion, is best to be compartmentalized to the setting is needed, right? In a plant operation where it is regimented, where precision is key, where safety is non-compromised, license to operate that cannot be, compromised again, right? Authoritarian method it will prevail, right? But in recycling and recovery, the one that we are pursuing right now, that's where you really need people to be creative, to be innovative, and the freedom to speak in an ecosystem that enable them to bring out good ideas. I think that's my pitch on that.
Okay. That's interesting, Dr. Joe, because I think that's an important point, right? It sounds like it's horses for courses. It appears that we recognize that there are a lot of different views, but it may not be the case that it's a one cookie solution which fits all. Yeah. Okay. If I can move on to Anya. Okay. So I'd like to bring it back to the element of media and interconnectedness when it comes to team of rivals, right? So there is this saying there is this proverb which I came across. For the want of a nail, the shoe was lost. For the want of a shoe, the horse was lost. And for want of a horse, the rider was lost. And for want of a rider, the message was lost, and the battle was lost, and the kingdom was lost. Okay, in this context, this is similar to the butterfly effect that we've heard in the past 2 days, right? But what came to my mind actually when I see this proverb in these past 2 days is that sounded like it took 1 or 2 months. The fact is today, the media and the interconnectedness, everything is immediate. The media has disinformation, elections are affected, things can go viral. So I guess my question to you, Anya, given the backdrop of how everything is connected, maybe you can share from your perspective, media and also academic side,
Sure.
the importance of their role in terms of building a team of
Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed listening to you all because even though it seems maybe a little bit strange, I think journalism and the media has a lot to say about all of the things that you're talking about. We talk a lot about contamination and garbage in the media ecosystem, and we have the balance of we have Google and Facebook spreading garbage in our system and contaminating the media ecosystem, but if you clamp down too much, then you don't get that diversity of views, which is so essential to the team of rivals, of hearing the unpopular views. So I would say to Malaysia, don't be afraid of adversity. Michael was talking a little bit about how do we know what we know and how do we avoid being siloed. And I think journalists spreading information are key. I would say maybe people wouldn't even know about potatoes if a journalist hadn't written an article to say, hey, they're eating this unusual thing. Why don't we try it? So I think that journalists have a very important role to play in educating society. I would say my first week of my class, I always talk to my students about the ASEAN conception of journalism. The post-colonial period, we had many countries who said the job of the journalist is to help societies develop and to bring people together. After you had context of race riots, a legacy of borders left by the British that made no sense, the job of the journalist was to unify the public. Today, of course, we have a lot of polarization promoted by journalists, but we also have things like the solution journalism movement, which is trying to help spread good ideas. But I still think that for societies to function, sometimes journalists will make you uncomfortable, and that's to be welcomed.
Thank you, Anya, for that perspective. Yeah, so I think based on the 3 feedbacks that we've had, I think we have a strong view in terms of there is the need for building a team of rivals because we value the diversity in views and we value the role of media in terms of as a maker-checker sort of mechanism which is out there. Yeah. Okay. Now allow me. So that first part was about that. Now the second part, I like to move on what are the pitfalls or the challenges that practitioners should be mindful of in pushing for team of rivals. I think I like to go to Michael. So I think a big part of the notion of your collective brain is built on the foundation of win-win, a collective goal. So in your book, you use this example when people were doing alchemy, it was just my goal. And that was very much individualistic. People weren't aware that over time, the result was the periodic table. So I guess my question to you, Michael, how important is this condition to make this work?
Yeah, so I mean, positive sum conditions or, the creation of, I think life is best lived when you interact with other people, you're looking for ways that you can both win, not where you win and someone else loses. And building a team means knowing that when we succeed, we're both going to get a share of this that is going to be better than if I went out on my own to do this. It's really difficult to build a team of rivals for multiple reasons. One of those is you need to have alignment on where you're going, and you have to have trust in the other person. Now, it doesn't have to be trust that they really care about you or have your best interests, but their incentives align with your incentives, and there's a common vision, a common goal. There's this quote from I think it's Antoine Saint-Exupéry, where he says, if you want people to go on a journey on a ship, don't teach them how to build ships. Teach them or make them yearn for the sea. If they yearn for the sea, then each of them will fall into their different parts. And we see this over and over again. So, when Kennedy was visiting NASA with the Apollo mission, trying to put a man on the moon, he met a janitor who was very busily cleaning. And many of you might know this story. And he asked the janitor, what are you doing? You're working so hard, so late. He said, sir, I'm trying to put a man on the moon. Right? Each person has a little piece that they play. Yesterday, when CAC, in her role as a VC, she was pointing out, one of the things that make founders work. She was pointing to this ability to create a mission and share that mission with others. Right? Mm-hmm. I saw that in Michelle's talk, in Fusion, and I certainly saw it in. Sorry, I forgot the young man's name, who was the space program.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I'm turning to an organizer here. Someone tell me. Which I was inspired. I was absolutely inspired. And I could tell that, when he shares his mission, when he shares his vision, he will inspire others and he will bring together that team of rivals. There's also a lot going on at an individual level, right? So we have a confirmation bias. We seek out things that already agree with us. if we're surrounded by other people who are like ourselves, we're likely to hear things that we already know. Many of your best ideas, job opportunities, or things you haven't thought about come from your weak links. You know, the people on Facebook or LinkedIn that you met once upon a time, or that person you didn't really like in high school who's living a completely different life. Or people you disagree with are more likely to give you some bit of information that you can use than the people you agree with, right? I love being wrong. If I am, please let me know, because that's the moment that I learn. And getting feedback, right? So creating a culture where people expect feedback, and know that that feedback is part of the learning process. It's reinforcement learning. No system can improve if it doesn't get some data and then learn how to operate on that data. So there's many, many barriers to building teams of rivals, but as we know in the literature, the most diverse teams have the lowest innovation outcomes and also the highest innovation and work outcomes. And it's the monocultural teams that have the middle. So what most companies do is say, I want more like me, and even if I'm looking for diversity, I'm looking for people who look different, but not really think different, right? People who are not truly diverse, because it's hard to make diversity work unless it's inclusive, unless you meet these criteria where there's common goals and you overcome those barriers.
Okay. Thank you, Michael. Dr. Joe, any challenges and pitfalls you foresee?
Yeah, thanks, Effie. So I think, again, I cannot stress enough that, diversity is a function of resource, right? If you compare MNCs, for example, I mean, they have the resources, right? They are able to attract a bigger pool of talent. They are able to lure, good candidates whenever they call for a talent replenishment. They have ecosystem and all that. And I do want to emphasize a bit on what Michael said just now with regards to hiring policy, right? And Michael, right? What you wrote, theories for everyone, and we talk about, the law of cooperation, right? You need to be able to bring in the room that for people that are able to challenge you, diverse opinion to enhance the collective of brain, right? But, again, the pitfall that we see here in this country or region or whatever it is, the choice of diversity is more on how do you look different than me, right? The age, the gender, and, the ethnicity and all that. And that doesn't help, actually, to bring this, attitude of able to challenge status quo and all that, right? And funny enough, once you hired them, eventually you'll ask that question, why am I being deprived from being challenged when the fault is yours? Because you have subconsciously, recruit people who are in the same mindset of you, right? So that's the ironic part of what you call this, of diversity, right? On the other hand, again, like I said, right, the whole ecosystem to enable diversity have to be there even before you start trying to push for it, right? For example, right? So, in Shell, I know there's a lot of Shell alumni here that probably will challenge me right after this. They have this window mobility policy, right? That everyone that comes to work for Shell, they have that 4 years window where they can actually apply elsewhere after the 4 years, right? It is a nightmare for me, for leaders like me, because knowledge retention can be a big thing, right? But it is so enriching for talent replenishment, right? And it also teach leaders not to be dependable on your people, right? Because nobody is indispensable, if you like, right? But from the context of diversity, and this is again to emphasize a bit what Michael say in terms of the zero-sum condition, right? In this case, positive-sum condition. If everyone in the company realize that he don't have to backstab, or he does not need to badmouth, or he does not need to stay myopic, and wait for the other person to make mistake before he comes with a solution, he need to know that he's be able to going up equally with the rest, right? And forget about nepotism and forget about favoritism. If you don't prepare a conducive environment when people can move up, no one will be able to want to have that courage to go out and challenge you, right? So it's a combination of resource, it's a combination of ecosystem, and obviously leadership plays a big role, right? Because a leader needs to be able to know when to intervene, right? The leader needs to take a stance in terms of, when she should stop, should we fall back to our corporate values, what is the real strategic intent and all that, because if you're not, this is where the divisive team will kick in.
Mm-hmm. If I could just give an example of what Johari said, in my book I talk about Enron effects, named after what Jeffrey Skilling did at Enron. So, Jeffrey Skilling's favorite book was The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins. And a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing, because how he saw the process of evolution was about competition. And so how do you create a competitive environment? You have things like rank and yank, which many companies are doing and Enron was famous for, which meant you rank all your employees and you chop off the bottom 15%. You fire them. And you do this repeatedly, and of course you're going to get the best of the best, right? That's how evolution works. But what he didn't realize was that competition and cooperation go hand in hand. In actual fact, more competitive industries have more cooperative companies because they go forward, because the prize is positive sum. The company wins it. So what he had done was created this lower scale of competition where people were incentivized not to work with one another for the betterment of Enron, but to cheat, lie, steal, form alliances, and harm one another. Right? He created a zero-sum environment within Enron that was not conducive to innovation, that was not conducive to the good of the company. And when you do that, at whatever level you do that, you're creating destructive competition rather than productive competition.
Thank you, Michael. I think Dr. Zhu, what you mentioned about the space, and to me what came out was actually it's also the leadership. And I think for all of us in this room here, right, I think sometimes we say we want diverse views. But yeah, I used to work for someone, not in Khazanah. It's like, you can discuss and debate as long as the conclusion is what I want. Right? And I think it's a hard question. So everyone in this room need to ask that hard question. Sure, we are debating here about having a modern team of rivals, but do you really want it? Right? Because it's a lot of work. And Michael, I think that example about the zero-sum game, I think that is really, really central to this discussion. Okay, Anya, I'd like to come to you on, we are still on pitfalls. So I like to go into talent. So there is a saying out there, the Gen Z is known for being, have highly values-driven, tech-savvy, vocal about social justice and transparency. So that's a rival to me, definitely. Right? So just wanted to get your perspectives, Anya, in terms of how does Gen Z have a role to play in a team of rivals?
Yeah, I think it's, I'd love to hear from Dr. Johari about this, but I find that young people have totally different standards of what is acceptable behavior. And I always joke with my class, when I go to a faculty meeting, all the men talk all the time, and the women never get a chance. And in my class, I've noticed that if a male student and a female student, raise their hand at the same time, the male always says, after you, and gives the woman some, as they would say, space to talk. And that is such a big contrast between the classroom and the faculty meeting. Another thing that my students do is if you're talking and you mention something bad that happened to you, like my grandmother died or I'm upset about the news, they always stop and they say, I'm so sorry that happened to you. And it's such a different way of relating to people. I think also their ideas about leadership are very different. I don't know if I should talk about that now or later, but you know, I always thought a good leader was somebody who made everybody else do what they wanted. And maybe because I'm an older sister, that was my idea. You should just get other people to do what you want. And before I came to Malaysia, I went into the chat for my students and I said, what do you think a leader is? What is good leadership? And I was shocked because it was totally different than what I thought of leadership. They said, a good leader listens to us. A good leader takes the blame when something goes wrong, which I had been taught. A good leader knows who we are, who our family is. A good leader is someone that we call at 1 in the morning if we have a problem. So completely different conception. Although then I did start thinking of all the times my students have called me for help. And I remembered one thing, which was years ago, it was Christmas Day. And one of my students' mother was riding an elephant in Thailand, and she fell off the elephant, and she was put in hospital. And my student called me to ask if I could find someone to go to the hospital in Chiang Mai and visit her mother. And luckily, Colombia is so diverse, I actually found several people to go to the hospital. But the idea that that's part of being a leader and not an exception, helping solve their problems, I thought was interesting and a generational shift, I think.
Thank you. Thank you.
If I can pick up your question to me, Anya, just now a bit in terms of how the millennials and the Gen Z responds to real work condition right now, right? So if you look or you reflect back what Simon Sinek's in terms of the golden circles, right? The why, how, and what. I think there's many CEOs in this room will agree to you that, you know, at this current junction, with the new work generation that we have right now, the whys suddenly become paramount, right? So long are the days where you just tell them how, what, and when, right? So, you know, my own experience when we are trying to shift the mindsets toward recovery and recycling, it's not just sufficient for you to say that, hey, from now on, we're going to be allocating capex more towards recovery and recycling. And, you know, I used to have this, you know, misinterpretation that the whys are more pertinent to the corporate office, to the, you know, to the marketing folks and all that. But surprisingly, right now, right, for those people, the young engineers at the plant, the young chemists and all that, they are demanding the whys too. Right, and they will debate with you if they feel that that why doesn't augur well with their thinking process. So I think that's, you know, what I see a bit more pertinent in the current generation.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Joe. Okay, so those are challenges and pitfalls that we've spoken about. I think now I'd like to go to our last part, which is the enablers. So I think in this room today, we have established that the need is real, the case is real, the pitfalls are real. So we still need to do this, yes. We recognize that it's a big world out there, different views. We have policymakers, we have business leaders, we have impact seekers, NGOs, consultants here in this hall today. The bankers might still be outside. So the question is, what would be the one or two things that you would like to share or impart that they can start doing tomorrow, next week, in building a modern-day team of rivals?
I mean, I've already said a number of things, like, you know, yearning for the sea, creating an environment where people are aligned with the purpose of the company, where there's a purpose to their work and they're not just working. That's important. But I guess, let me give a few practical examples. Often, if you are trying to, in the context of an M&A or in the context where you have very different cultural differences, explicitness of communication is critical. So over time, you get efficiency in communication through jargon, but this is a barrier to newcomers entering the scene. And I think one of my favorite examples of this isn't actually at a company level; it's at a country level. There's data that shows that countries that have had long-run histories of migration and that are highly multicultural tend to be more explicit in their emotional expression and communication. And, I see smiling as one example of this. Americans are known for their wide smiles. I've noticed a lot of smiling in Malaysia too, which is a highly multicultural society. Now, if you contrast that with somewhere like Japan, which is highly monocultural, or Russia, there isn't that need to be so explicit about communication because another Japanese person knows what a person knows just from the context. There's no need to express it. But if your neighbor is Greek and you're from Turkey or something, the only common language you have is communication. And this is actually an example of this is when McDonald's, after the fall of the Soviet Union, McDonald's set up offices in Russia. And Russia is a tight culture that is not known for smiling. And so they were trying to convince the employees to smile because they wanted the all-American experience. And the Russians said, we can't do that, sir. In Russia, the only people who smile when something isn't funny are crazy people. And so they said, okay, but you don't understand. This is about, this is about the American experience, and we're going to train the customers too. So through a lot of training programs, and if you Google it, Russia still runs these smile training programs, by the way. In order to convince them, they said, okay, but in McDonald's we're going to do this. So Russians came to realize that if you smile and it's not funny, you're either crazy or you're American. It's fine. But just as a mnemonic, in a company too, the use of jargon, an onboarding process that requires a lot of time is a massive barrier. Sometimes there's no choice, right? So if you need sales and engineering to get along, you don't necessarily have to share a language, but one thing you can do is create translators and bridges. So rotating people through the company, having a few individuals spend some time with the other team, then they learn to speak both languages, so to speak. And as a result of that, they're able to bridge these two teams and have the teams coordinate much more effectively in the context of that diversity.
Okay. Dr.
Okay. So I think the pitch that I really want to deliver is that, you don't let diversity stays at the rhetoric level, right? Because it will come back to you, right? You only propagate diversity when you're ready, right? Where your ecosystem allows you to do so. And it's not just because of a ticking in a box kind of exercise. So I'll give you an example again. Some of the best practice that I see in a MNCs, right? Shell, again, right? So when you interview or you basically apply for a global role, there will be questions posed by your interviewers, right? And these are not questions a bit about your competency or your experience or your mobility and all that. That's all given, right? If you somehow bluff your way through, there will be the shortest stint of assignment that you will ever have. But the questions that people are anticipating are about when was the last intervention that you did, right? When's the last time you argued with a boss and you challenge his decision? And these are no secret questions, right? People anticipate these questions. And because of that, I think the reflection that you provide to your employees is that you are expected to challenge. You are expected to debate. You need to be in the process of deliberation and all that. So what I'm trying to say is that the ecosystem itself reflects that kind of conducive, what you call this, environment to your people. Now, the second pitch I have is that I don't think diversity, there's one strategy that fits all, right? For Shell and ExxonMobil, both of them have different approach. Shell is a bit more consensus, real people organization. I just love their way of, encouraging all of these people issues to be flushed out and all that. But it can be protected. Speed to market can be compromised, right? Whereas ExxonMobil is, is sharp, is precise, ruthless, maybe, at time, but their decision is swift. Right? At times, sometimes you start to wonder which is the better way of, managing diversity there, right? Because for Exxon, for example, their culture is very clear for everyone, right? They emphasize on bottom line, right? So that example you gave, Effie, earlier a bit about the paradox between market share and profit margin. That does not augur well. You want market share, they're going to be compromised a bit on profit margin, right? Whereas other organizations, they want both, right? So there's going to be a dilemma, a conflict, hence the culture is less or rather ambiguous to people, and you cannot blame people to be lost. And that's where diversity can be compromised. I think that's my position.
Thank you, Dr. Anya?
Yeah, there's so much here in both of what you've been saying. I'm going to try to collect my thoughts. I guess there's a couple of things I want to say, which is completely agree that communication is vital. And I think that journalists, for example, one of the ways they dealt with the decline of trust in media was to try to communicate more to their audiences, to invite them to come to the newsroom, to meet with them, to solicit their ideas. And I'm trying to do that a lot more with my students to explain sort of academia and our funny folkways and strange customs and how we do things. And I think that helps diffuse resentment. I think that there's so much polarization in the world and people are too easy to like get angry. So I think talking and communicating is vital. One of my colleagues, a sociologist at the New School, has just written a new book about charm and leadership. And her argument is that the old days, it was about charisma, you know, the powerful leader sort of radiating charisma. And nowadays, it's much more about charm. So one-on-one communication, you know, sitting down in a diner, talking to people, explaining yourself. And she points out that Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand is the classic example of that, sitting with people, filming YouTube videos from the back of the car with her children, and that this is really a new style of leadership. And I remember during the pandemic, when Donald Trump was going around being a racist and accusing China and being sort of dangerous and incompetent, we had in my class, we got someone from the New Zealand government to come on the Zoom and talk to us about their communication strategy. And one of their big slogans had been, "Be kind." And people literally on the Zoom, we started to cry, because the idea of a leader that emphasizes kindness was so powerful. But I think I also want to say that it's important not to forget, as you pointed out, action. It's not just about communication. It's about the basics, paying people properly, not exploiting them. You know, again, looking at you, big tech, actually paying your taxes. And I think all of those things are essential as well. If you're a terrible company or you're a terrible person or you're a terrible government, then all the communication won't save you if you're not behaving properly.
Okay, thank you, Anya. Okay, I think we can move to Q&A. Yes, sir, number 3.
Anthony Lau, board member of Time.com. But prior to Time.com and adjunct professor in UNITA International University, I'm also with Endeavour Malaysia. I had 28 years of industry corporate experience based in Geneva, Vevey, Switzerland, covering 119 countries, 17 time zones. I would like to just share with you the industry perspective that I have. I think your title, Building a Modern Day Team of Rivals, doesn't seem to apply when you manage a team of value creators who put the company and the customer first in everything that they do. Because a leader in a corporate world today is responsible to continue to create value, top line, bottom line, and capital efficiency. Any team today will realize, anywhere in the world, because the topic that we focus on is how do you win and lead in today's turbulent times in the new international reality. And the new international reality is, it hasn't changed. The North Star is still your customer. The one who goes to the counter, take out the money, put your product on the table and pay for it and goes back home and enjoy it with the family. That is your North Star, your customer. and your customer is the one that the entire leadership team and people works for. If you have no customer, you have no business.
Sir, can we get to your question?
Okay. My question is, I think your title, Building a Modern Day Team of Rivals, does not apply to the business world. It applies maybe in politics, it applies maybe in some other industry, but very clearly, in today's world, you want your team to jump into the same train, even though you're in a crowded train station with 100 trains, they all jump on the same train, they may get off at different level, nobody jump on different train going north, south, east, west. It is all putting customer first in everything you do and generate value for the entire organization and creating shared values for the society and the customers.
Sir, thank you so much. That still is not a question, but thank you. Okay, I have a good question here.
I was going to say, Effie, I don't think any of us would argue with that. Good customer service, when we spend so much time trying to get good customer service and feeling frustrated, I think those are inspiring words, and I bet everybody in this room feels the same way.
Thank you, Anya. Okay, I have an interesting question from the floor. Michael, in your book, tolerance for failure is a key requirement for a positive sum game. In Malaysia context, I am skeptical. In 2018, Malaysia ended its 61-year party rule. 6 years have passed. We have had 4 prime ministers, 3 governments, full-on scrutiny from the internet and the guys on X. It is very clear that there is no tolerance for failure. What can we do as a country, as an enterprise, in order to get that tolerance of failure? Because that's the way to move forward.
I mean, it sounds like Malaysia has been tolerating failure for a while. But seriously, I think there's, if you look, there's a difference between when you are at the technological frontier and you don't know the direction you're going to go in, versus you are still catching up and you kind of know where you're going. It's the difference between innovation in the everyday and a kind of Manhattan project. China is a good example of this. When you are, when you're catching up with everyone, it is really about taking these best solutions, localizing them, making them your own, and a strong centralized autocratic government is actually more effective at doing that. And this is a principle that goes back to like the Peloponnesian War, where the Athenians were complaining that the Spartans just followed the leader, and the Athenians are debating over democracy about when to attack and when not to attack, and losing the war as a result of that. But once you cross that and you don't know where to go anymore, if we knew where to go, then we would just go. And if we don't know where to go, we have to have an environment where we can try different things, some of which have to fail. Because as I said, if you knew the answer in advance and you knew that success was guaranteed, you would just do it. But you can't know that in advance, so you have to let 1,000 flowers bloom. You allow a kind of evolutionary environment. In my talk, I gave the example of Justice Brandeis referring to the United States, each state as a laboratory, or Microsoft turning itself into an ecosystem of startups. Again, not all of those startups will, it's Silicon Valley. Most of it is a failure. But the successes pay for the rest. Now, if you do not tolerate failure, that means you never tolerate doing something different. You always tolerate safety. You will never try something different and go somewhere new. You'll always be doing the same thing. So, how do you change a culture? Again, that too requires some mutations. It requires a few brave leaders to try something new. As long as there's a large enough market share and you're a large enough company, you can afford to have that kind of skunkworks, R&D, that failure division that might occasionally show you something new.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Another question which came in. It's good to indeed leverage on diversity, but we also need to take into account the cultural nuances for inclusion. Asia School of Business and ICLIF did a study on this to help leaders. What does the panel think is needed to lead this in Asia? Sorry,
I didn't catch that. What was the first bit?
Cultural differences. what can we do? What do we think is needed to lead this in Asia? Maybe Anya, you want to?
Like, since I'm not Asian, I'm not sure I'm the best person. I hate to pass this. I think I'm giving this one to Dr. Johari, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I mean, it is such a general question, right? In terms of, I mean, Malaysia, we have multiple race here, right? And to me, it goes back to the ecosystem that we mentioned just now, right? The ability and the culture of respect, right? In the sense that we don't marginalize opinion from the minority group and all that. So I can't think of any special tactics that we can deploy to actually tackle this, other than the typical, the ecosystem that we need to build.
I'm going to give a controversial answer. I think that one of the most underutilized aspects of a multicultural society is, in fact, judging other cultures in order to learn from them. Other cultures represent different cultural traits, different values, different things, and if some of them are doing well, we kind of want to, it's an important question to find out why and what others, other groups might learn so they could do the same thing. And if you have these different experiments going on, it's a wonderful thing. There's a leader in a small country nearby, I won't mention his name, who had a nice quote about the difference between the United States and China. He said, Han nationalism will have a hard time competing, even though there's a billion, it'll have a hard time competing with the United States, even though it's 300 million people, who can draw on the world's 7 to 8 billion people and create something brand new. You're drawing in the best talent, you're learning from these different groups, you're creating something new. Now, China's solution, by the way, to that is to train people overseas and bring them back, so it might actually work. But you have to ultimately solve that problem. The other side of this is repeatedly in the literature, what we see is, and it sounds so silly, but listening to one another seriously in order to learn from one another. If you look at Google's Project Aristotle, which looked at what were the key features of well-functioning groups, the one that came out at the highest was psychological safety. That is, creating an environment where people feel willing to bring themselves, share what they really think, and have other people listen to them and evaluate them. And alongside that is a willingness to not strawman the other person in order to win the argument, but steelman them, so to help them make the argument even better, because we are ultimately pursuing truth, we're ultimately pursuing customer welfare, we're ultimately pursuing where we want to go, not trying to have little wins. And creating that culture of psychological safety, steelmanning the opposition, and learning from other cultures is how we make this thing work.
Thank you. We'll go to number 3, and then after that, number 2.
So my name is Iqbal Khan from Pajar Capital in Dubai. Just 1 minute context is this: as the world is deglobalizing, decivilizing, there is a phenomena called majority-minority nations across the world where the majority is feeling like a minority. And this means that in terms of leadership and culture, often it's very difficult to bring in talent into different countries because there are barriers which are being put all around us. And in such a phenomenon, when we look back at our history of Islam, it was always that the Prophet taught us competence was more important than loyalty. Many of his appointments when he made, they were made on the basis of meritocracy. I think in the current context, and I would like to ask the panel, how can we ensure in such an environment where Brexit is happening, where walls are being put together, not only for trade tariffs, but humans are not finding it difficult. We have businesses in many parts of the GCC, and in every country we find it difficult to get work permits. How do we bring talent into it? So what does the panel think in such an environment can corporations, which are private sector, but also governments do to make sure that the competence versus loyalty paradigm and meritocracy prevails?
I mean, if no one else wants to, I said in my talk as well, like, keep fighting for meritocracy. All the, Genghis Khan famously led these armies. He came from nothing. He came from an outcast tribe. And he said, it doesn't matter what tribe you come from, you can rise to the ranks. China civil service exams, the United States during its heyday, meritocracy. people don't necessarily want equality of outcomes, but they do want fairness, where the game isn't rigged from the beginning, that, you know, the happenstance of your birth determines the ceiling and what you can achieve. That's what people react. Societies vary on what exactly fairness looks like. They have variation on the importance of things like freedom, but they care about their children, and they care that there's fairness in that, and meritocracy is a way to ensure that.
So
keep
I
fighting
think,
for it.
I think in the US, meritocracy is becoming an excuse to exclude. And so I would almost take the other view, which is you can give me someone mediocre and incompetent, and I will educate them to become competent. So I'm a great believer in education as a way of building people up and developing them. I mean, obviously I'm not hiring for businesses, but I'm dealing with a range of people, and I think everybody can learn and improve and grow if they apply themselves and if they're taught. So that's my contribution.
As long as you don't believe talent is fixed, then I think we're on the same page.
Yeah. Thank you.
Comment that, I mean, look at the appointments in White House in America. Each administration, you go through double vetting. One is the Senate hearing everything else, but the political advisors also clear those names, and that is based on loyalty to the principles. And that means there's always the suboptimal choices are being made. And that was my point, that all across the world we see this paradigm of competence versus loyalty. As Muslims, we have been taught by our Prophet that to prefer competence over loyalty. All his appointments, whether it was for Khalid bin Walid as the commander-in-chief, he could not even read 4 surahs of the Quran. But he was made commander-in-chief because he was the best in that category. So that was my point, which I was saying.
Yeah, I mean, what you're seeing, I think, is a breakdown in cooperation, where people are picking my person and not the best person. And, you know, a lot of the book is about why that is.
Do we have time for one more last question?
Thank you for the clarification. I think that's very interesting.
Thank you. Last question.
Sorry. Hello, Moaz from Khazanah here. Just have like I guess two very short questions. So I think like Professor Michael mentioned, intellectual arbitrage is a way to sort of build a team of rivals, right? So like in your view, like how best do we explore and find these intellectual arbitrages? Because like you don't know what you don't know until you don't know it, right? And then as we go ahead yearning for yam, or like in pursuit of potatoes, basically, like how do you ensure that all the diverse experiences and knowledge, they're not compromised towards like one line of thinking at the end of the day? Because like you started diverse, then as the more you work together, you might like get into like one line of thinking, and then you lose the diversity at the end of the day. So just those two. Thank you very much.
Michael.
I don't know if there's time to answer. On the first point, an openness to new experiences and actively seeking out disagreement, people you disagree with, people who might have a solution that's adjacent to you. It's a kind of search process. That's what intellectual arbitrage looks like. And if you look across the innovation record, this is often what leads to recombination. What was your second question? Sorry. Oh, right.
Yeah, it's about avoiding conformity at the end of the day.
So, I mean, so there is eventually, people like to talk a lot about diversity, but if you think from an evolutionary perspective, you need diversity and selection. So that diversity does get shrunk down to the better stuff eventually, but then it reopens new possibilities of diversity. So I don't think you should be too afraid of it unless it's not in the adaptive direction.
Okay, thank you, Moaz. Thank you, Michael. So on that note, I think we've reached to the end of time. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. Hope you found this session beneficial. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Effie and the panelists, for that wonderful discussion. Please step forward so we can take a photograph commemorating the final KMF 2024 panel session.